At 7:12 on a Monday morning, Elise Whitfield unlocked the door to her office on the 4th floor of an old building in Chicago's South Loop. She hadn't even had time to set her coffee cup down on the desk before she saw the boy. He was standing right outside the door, alone. 7 years old, an oversized gray hoodie, a Spider-Man backpack hanging off one shoulder, and an iPad with a cracked corner clutched tight against his chest, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. But what made Elise stop wasn't the iPad, wasn't the backpack, and wasn't even the fact that a child was standing alone in a 4th-floor hallway at 7 in the morning. What made her stop was his eyes, the kind of eyes no child should ever have. Eyes that had already made every decision before he came here. "I need to hire you," the boy said. His voice didn't shake. It didn't hesitate. "I have money." Elise looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she looked down the hallway. No adult anywhere. No one waiting by the stairs. No one standing at the elevator. This child had come here alone, and he didn't look lost. "What's your name?" "Micah." "Who brought you here, Micah?" "A town car service. I used my dad's account and told the driver you were my new tutor." He didn't look back. She almost thought he was joking, but there was no room for jokes in that face. That face had left childhood behind a very long time ago. He opened the iPad. The screen lit up, and Elise saw a photograph, a hidden shot, taken from a low angle, from under a bed or through the crack of a door. In the picture was a man sitting alone in a dark room at 3:14 in the morning, the timestamp clear in the corner. The man was wearing a wrinkled shirt, his wrists resting on his thighs, his eyes open but seeing nothing. His mouth was slightly open, not because he was speaking, but as though he'd forgotten how to close it. He was awake, but he wasn't there. "That's my dad," Micah said. His voice was flat in the way only children who have practiced talking about fear too many times can make a voice go flat. "My dad is disappearing." Elise looked at the photograph, looked at the boy. Her first instinct was to call the police, contact family, or at the very least ask the boy for his home address. That's what a normal person would have done, but Elise Whitfield wasn't normal. She was a forensic auditor, born in Ohio, orphaned at 9, raised in 3 foster homes, and not one of them kept her for more than 2 years. She had taught herself, tested herself, earned her degree in forensic accounting on a full scholarship, and spent the last 6 years tracing money through places money was never supposed to go. She had sat across from men who hid $40 million inside shell companies and watched them try to convince her she'd made a mistake in the math. She had never made a mistake in the math, but no one under 8 years old had ever stood at her office door at 7 in the morning with evidence on an iPad with a cracked corner. "If you call the house," Micah said, as if he'd read her thoughts, "she'll know. And my dad will sign the papers." "Who is she?" Micah didn't answer right away. He swiped across the iPad and opened a folder. Inside wasn't a child's mess. Inside were files, dates, times, event descriptions, screenshots, short videos, notes typed into an app in the default font, but there was nothing remotely default about the contents. A 7-year-old child had built a forensic file over the course of months, alone, in silence, while the whole world of adults around him either didn't see it or pretended not to. Then Elise saw the numbers. In the middle of one page of notes, Micah had snapped a photo of his father's computer screen, taken quickly and slightly crooked, but clear enough. Account codes, transfer amounts, transaction dates, 4 transfers, each for $10 million, moved through 4 separate entities over the span of 3 weeks. Elise's hand stopped on the desk. Not from fear, from recognition. Numbers don't lie. They never do. And these numbers were saying that someone was moving $40 million out of an account whose owner was no longer lucid enough to know it. She opened her laptop, entered the account codes into the public records system, waited. The results came up. 4 shell companies, registered in Delaware, the Cayman Islands, and Singapore. Credentials fully authenticated. Biometrics complete. On paper, the account holder had done everything himself. On paper, nothing was wrong. But in real life, a 7-year-old boy was sitting in the chair across from her, his feet not touching the floor, his Spider-Man backpack on the ground, waiting for one adult to believe him. "What's your father's name?" Elise asked. "Reed Calloway." She didn't need Google for that name. In Chicago, nobody needed Google for Reed Calloway. Calloway Holdings, real estate, finance, and whispers nobody dared say out loud. The most powerful man south of the Chicago River, the man both police and criminals knew by name, respected, and didn't want to disturb. And his son was sitting in her office, his feet swinging 4 inches above the floor, saying his father was disappearing. If this moment is what's keeping you here, then you're exactly where you should be. Because this story doesn't begin with anything obvious. It begins with a 7-year-old child taking an Uber to a stranger's office at 7 in the morning, carrying an iPad with a cracked corner full of evidence no adult could be bothered to see. And trust me, what happens after that moment will change everything. So before we go any further, if this feels like the kind of story worth hearing all the way through, hit like so I'll know you're here. Share this video with a friend who loves stories that can't be predicted. And subscribe, with the notification bell on, so the next time a story like this begins, you won't miss it. Now let's see what happens when Elise Whitfield decides to believe a 7-year-old boy instead of calling the police. Elise kept her eyes on the child sitting across from her for 10 more seconds. 10 seconds were enough for her to make the kind of decision any ordinary person would have called insane. She rose from her chair, pulled her coat off the back of it, slipped her laptop into her backpack, checked for the external hard drive in the desk drawer, then tucked it into the inside pocket of her coat. She didn't call the police. She didn't call social services. She didn't call anyone at all, because Elise Whitfield had lived long enough to know that the system doesn't save children who sit alone in a stranger's office at 7 in the morning. The system moves them from one house to another, stuffs their belongings into black garbage bags, and calls that a change in placement. She knew that because she had been one of those children. 9 years old, standing in front of a burning house on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, the smell of smoke in her hair and the sound of fire sirens behind her. Her parents never made it out. No one ever explained why. They just put her in a car, placed her in another house with other adults, and told her everything would be fine. Everything wasn't fine. The first foster family kept her for 14 months, then sent her back because she was not a good fit. The second family had a man who drank too much, and a woman who spent her days staring out the window as if Elise didn't exist. The third family was Pearl, her biological grandmother, the one the system took 4 years to find, and by the time they found her, she was 67 years old, with a lung disease she'd hidden, so they would let her keep her granddaughter. Pearl wasn't wealthy. She lived in a 2-room apartment on the west side, grew basil on the windowsill, and wore a silver bracelet she'd had on since the day she married Elise's grandfather. She said one thing to Elise, and Elise carried it with her forever. You don't need anyone to believe you. You just need evidence. Pearl died when Elise was 14. The silver bracelet now rests on Elise's left wrist, cool, thin, and the only thing she has left from the idea of family in her life. She taught herself, tested herself, earned a degree in forensic accounting on a full scholarship at the University of Illinois, and spent the 6 years after that tracing money through places money was never supposed to go. Pearl had said, "You need evidence." Elise turned her whole life into an instrument for finding it. And now, looking at Micah Calloway, she saw a child sitting with that same heavy silence she had seen in her office earlier. His small frame swallowed by the chair and the gravity of his choices. A child who had run out of options. "Let's go," she said. Micah didn't ask where. He stood, pulled on his backpack, clutched the iPad, and walked to the door ahead of her, as though he'd already known her answer before she ever opened her mouth. In the taxi, Chicago slid past the windows in the early morning light, gray and cold and full of possibility. Micah sat upright, eyes forward, and began to speak. Not the way children tell stories. Like a briefing. Calloway Tower, floors 38 through 40, a 3-level penthouse. The main entrance had 2 rotating guards, facial recognition cameras in the lobby, but the service entrance in back, where deliveries came in through the basement, had only 1 camera, and the guard changed shift at 7:45, leaving a 12-minute gap between shifts. Micah knew the code to the side door leading into the kitchen, 4 digits, because he'd watched the private chef punch it in enough times to remember it. He knew which rooms Corinne hadn't installed cameras in because he'd spent 3 months counting the blinking lights on every surveillance device in the house and testing them by walking through those rooms, then waiting to see if anyone asked questions. His room was safe. His father's study was safe if they got there before 9 in the morning, because Corinne never woke before 8:30. Elise listened without interrupting. She looked at this 7-year-old child reciting the security layout of his own home with a level of precision most adults don't possess, and she understood one thing with brutal clarity. Micah Calloway wasn't unlike other children because he was smarter than they were. He was unlike them because he was more afraid. Fear, if it lasts long enough, will turn anyone into an expert on the world around them. Elise knew that because she had once been exactly the same. The taxi stopped 2 blocks from Callaway Tower, just as Micah had instructed. He said they shouldn't stop directly in front of the building because the exterior cameras scanned the parking area. They got out and walked the rest of the way. Wind off Lake Michigan struck their faces head-on, cold and sharp. Callaway Tower rose before them, 40 stories of glass and steel, the top of the building vanishing into the low morning clouds. Somewhere at the summit of that tower, the most powerful man south of the Chicago River was sitting in the dark with his eyes open and seeing nothing, and his 7-year-old son was leading a strange woman through the back entrance to save him. They went in through the basement delivery entrance at 7:47, 2 minutes after the old security shift had left and before the new one had reached its post. Micah entered 4 numbers on the keypad by the side door to the kitchen without even looking, his small fingers moving on muscle memory, quick and exact, like someone who had rehearsed it hundreds of times in his mind before ever doing it for real. The door opened. The kitchen was dark and cold, carrying the smell of stainless steel and industrial cleaner, the metal counters catching the pale green glow of the exit lights. The private chef hadn't arrived yet, Micah said without turning around. He starts at 8. They moved through the kitchen, down a service hallway with concrete floors and exposed ventilation ducts overhead, then into the service elevator. Micah pressed for the 38th floor. The elevator was older than the main one, trembling faintly, washed in a dull yellow light. When the doors opened, Elise stepped into the Callaway penthouse, and the first thing she felt wasn't luxury but emptiness. The penthouse was enormous, with high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling glass walls looking east over Lake Michigan and south across the Chicago skyline. The furniture was minimalist, all white and gray and black, every piece expensive in the way that doesn't need a price tag. Pale gray marble floors lay cold beneath her feet, the kind of cold that seeps through the soles of your shoes. Not a speck of dust, not a single book left open on a table, not a coat draped over the back of a chair, and no family photographs. Elise let her eyes move across the main living room, the dining area, the hallway leading into the West Wing. Not one photograph, no wedding portrait, no picture of Micah as a baby, no family portrait of 3, not a single human face on any wall or shelf anywhere in the space her eyes could reach. This home had been bleached clean. Someone had erased every trace of the people who had once lived here and replaced them with the sterile perfection of a showroom. Micah led her into Reed's study at the end of the East Wing, a smaller room than the rest of the penthouse, with dark wood walls and a massive walnut desk. This was the only room that still held the faintest breath of human life. A leather chair worn smooth at the arms, scratches on the desk surface, and on the bookshelf behind it, lying face down and hidden behind a row of law books, the only photograph in the entire penthouse. Reed was holding Micah as a newborn, Micah red-faced and wrinkled in a hospital blanket, and in the background, slightly blurred but clear enough, a brown-haired woman was smiling. Marin. The photograph had been turned face down. Someone had flipped it over, and someone hadn't thrown it away, maybe because they didn't know it was there. Micah gave her the computer password, a string of characters he'd memorized because he'd watched his father type it often enough from the corner of the room. Elise sat down in the chair, powered up the machine, and entered the password. The system opened. She didn't go into the bank accounts. She didn't need to, not with the data already on Micah's iPad. What she needed were the system access logs, the digital traces ordinary people never look at. But for a forensic auditor, they are the most detailed map of the truth. She opened the system log and began to read. 4 transfers of $10 million each, carried out over 3 weeks, each authenticated with full biometric verification, fingerprint, voice, PIN. On paper, Reed Callaway had sat in this very chair and executed every one of those transfers himself. But the network logs told another story. Every transfer showed 2 devices connected to the system at the same time. The first device was this computer, Reed's desktop, registered in his name, on the penthouse's internal IP. The second device was also connected through the penthouse's internal IP, but it was registered under the name Corinne Voss. Elise checked the timestamps. Both devices connected at the same moment, less than 4 seconds apart, which meant that while Reed's computer carried out the transfer using his biometrics, Corinne's device was connected in parallel, monitoring the process or controlling it remotely. Elise dug deeper. The biometric authentication, fingerprint, and voice hadn't been forged. They were real. but the logs showed a pattern. Every time the biometrics were used, Reed had been logged into the system at least 30 minutes beforehand, without performing a single action. 30 minutes with the computer on, the session active, no input. As if someone had placed Reed in front of the machine, pressed his finger to the sensor, made him speak the confirmation code, then carried out the transaction from another device while he sat there, eyes open, but not truly present. The biometrics hadn't been faked. The biometrics had been harvested. Someone had collected Reed's fingerprints and voice while he was unconscious, or in a state where he wasn't lucid enough to understand what he was doing, then used his own body like a living key. Elise leaned back in the chair. Her hands went still on the keyboard. She had traced money through 7 countries. She had sat across from men who had embezzled tens of millions of dollars without blinking, but this was the first time she had ever seen someone turned into an authentication tool for the theft of his own fortune. She began taking screenshots. Each log, each timestamp, each device name. Evidence. Pearl had said, "You need evidence." This was evidence. She was taking the 12th screenshot when Micah touched her elbow. She looked at him. His face had gone white, his eyes fixed on a point above her head. Elise heard it then, the chime of the main elevator. In this penthouse, only one person used the main elevator. Elise looked at the clock. 8:15. Micah had said Corinne never woke before 8:30. But clocks don't lie, and neither does the sound of an elevator arriving. Corinne Voss had come home early. Micah moved before Elise had time to react. He caught her by the wrist and pulled her out of the chair, snapping the laptop shut with the haunting efficiency of a soldier who had moved on this invisible track 1,000 times in the dark. He didn't say where they were going. He just pulled. The two of them left the study, turned left down the east wing hallway, past 2 closed doors, and Micah pushed open the third, then closed it behind them without a sound. Micah's room, smaller than any room Elise had passed through in this penthouse, and also the only one that looked lived in. A twin bed left unmade, a pale blue blanket wrinkled across it, a stuffed bear with one worn ear lying on the pillow, a low bookshelf with comic books shoved in uneven stacks, and on the wall, a photograph, the only photograph properly displayed in the entire penthouse. Reed and Micah sitting on outdoor steps somewhere, maybe a park. Micah, about 4 years old, grinning wide, and Reed looking at his son with a face completely open. No fog, no haze, a man still whole. Elise heard footsteps in the hallway outside, heels on marble, steady and confident, and then a second voice, not a woman's voice, a man's, low, speaking English with the faint trace of an accent too blurred to place, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who's lived in too many places to belong anywhere. Micah pointed to the corner of the room, where an old intercom panel was mounted on the wall, the kind of internal communication system installed when the penthouse was first built and never removed. Micah switched it on, turned the volume down low, and tipped his head for Elise to come closer. Corinne's voice crackled through the small speaker, slightly distorted by the age of the system but clear enough. "Everything is moving on schedule. He'll sign," the man answered, and Elise heard the name for the first time. "Your schedule isn't moving fast enough, Corinne. The board meeting is in 5 days. I need the signed authorization before then. Not next week. Not Friday. Before the meeting." Corinne said something Elise couldn't quite make out, her voice dropping as if she'd turned her head away. Then the man's voice came again, sharper now, his patience thinning. "Increase the dosage if you have to. I don't need him awake. I need him holding a pen," Corinne answered, this time clearly enough. "I already increased it. 2 days ago. He barely recognized Micah yesterday morning." Elise looked at Micah. The boy was staring at the intercom speaker with a face gone completely blank, but his hand was gripping the edge of the bed so hard his knuckles had turned white. He had heard conversations like this before, maybe many times. Maybe that was why he knew how to use this intercom system. The man's voice continued, calm again now, cold and controlled. "The signing moves to tomorrow night. The charity event at the Art Institute. The lawyer, the witnesses, the notary. Everyone will be there. Natural, legal, no one will ask questions." The footsteps moved away. The elevator doors opened and closed. Silence. Elise let out a breath. She hadn't even finished absorbing what she'd just heard when Micah's bedroom door opened. No knock, no warning. The door simply opened, and Reed Calloway stood there. He was taller than he had looked in the iPad photo, broader through the shoulders. His shadow filled the doorway in the way only a body trained to dominate space can fill it. He was wearing a wrinkled white shirt, barefoot, hair uncombed, and his eyes were hazy. The same eyes Elise had seen in the photograph on Micah's iPad, open but not seeing, awake but not present. But his body wasn't hazy. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His eyes swept across the room, found Micah, moved past him, found Elise, and stopped. A stranger, in his son's room. Everything happened in less than 2 seconds. Reed stepped forward, his left hand coming up, and seized Elise by the wrist. The grip was clumsy and desperate, driven not by clear thought but by the raw, heavy instinct of a man who had spent a lifetime protecting his territory, even as his mind struggled to recognize the intruder. It was the weight of a dying fire, uncoordinated, yet still capable of burning anyone who ventured too close. Elise didn't yank her hand back. She stood still, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she could see his eyes, and in those eyes there was no malice, only the disorientation of an animal kept too long inside a glass cage, trying to tell the difference between danger and everything else. "Dad," Micah's voice, small, calm, the kind of calm that has been practiced. "This is the person you told me to remember. The one who checks numbers. You said if anything ever happened to you, this is the person I call." I called her. Reed looked down at his son. The haze shifted. It didn't clear, but it shifted, like water disturbed by a stone. He looked back at Elise, looked at her wrist in his hand, looked at his fingers blanching the skin where they gripped her. Then he let go. Slowly, one finger at a time, as though each finger needed its own separate command to open. He didn't say a word. He stepped back, his shoulders brushing the doorframe, then turned and walked into the hallway, barefoot on the cold marble, each step a little uneven, like a man walking the deck of a ship in rough water. Elise watched him until his shape vanished beyond the corner of the hall. Then she looked down at her left wrist. 4 red marks, finger-shaped, right beside Pearl's silver bracelet, the handprint of the most dangerous man in Chicago. A man who had been poisoned for 6 months and still had enough strength in his grip to bruise her skin. The lion was lost behind a chemical veil, but the teeth were still there. Reed was gone, and Micah closed the bedroom door and sat back down on the bed. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He simply opened the iPad, swiped through 3 folders, and stopped on a video file. Then he turned the screen toward Elise and pressed play without saying a word, as if he had been preparing for this moment for a very long time, and now all he needed was for someone else to see the thing he had spent too many nights seeing alone. The video was dark. The angle was low, shot from beneath the bed, the iPad lens jutting out just far enough to catch the hallway through the narrow opening of Micah's bedroom door. Timestamp in the upper corner, 2:11 in the morning. The penthouse hallway was lit only by the motion lights along the baseboards, a pale yellow glow, enough to see shapes but not enough to see them clearly. Then a figure passed by. Corinne. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair loose, moving with soft purpose. The walk of someone who knew exactly where she was going and didn't want anyone to hear. She stopped outside Reed's bedroom, opened the door without knocking, and disappeared inside. Micah had filmed this from under his own bed, through the crack of his own bedroom door, at 2 in the morning. He had set an alarm to do it, 7 years old, setting an alarm for 2 in the morning to gather evidence against the woman poisoning his father. The video kept running. 4 minutes later, Corinne came out of Reed's room. But this time Micah's camera caught her at a better angle because she stopped right in front of his bedroom door, turned her face toward the light, and checked something on her phone. And in that moment, Elise saw it. Corinne's left hand was holding a small device, about half the size of a matchbox, medical white, with a flat end and a tiny LED blinking blue. Elise rewound the footage, watched it again, froze the frame, zoomed in. That device wasn't a syringe, wasn't a pill, wasn't a bottle. It was something smaller, quieter, and more modern. Elise opened the laptop and started searching. 15 minutes later, she had her answer. A transdermal microdelivery device, medical technology used in the treatment of chronic illness, allowing drugs to be administered continuously through a patch attached to the skin, usually at the nape of the neck or the inner arm, places a patient is less likely to notice. Legal when prescribed. Legal when the drug inside is FDA approved. Legal when the patient has consented. But if some other compound is loaded into it, if the person wearing it has no idea what it is doing, then the device becomes something no medical dictionary ever wants to name. Elise remembered. When Reed had stood in Micah's doorway 10 minutes earlier, she had seen it without realizing what she was seeing. At the back of his neck, just below the hairline, there had been a small flesh-colored patch, one edge beginning to curl, looking like an ordinary medical adhesive, the kind anyone would ignore if they didn't know what to look for. Corinne said it was a heart monitor patch. Micah said she changed it every 2 days, always at 2 in the morning, always while his father was asleep. Elise needed the data from that device. She couldn't remove it. She wasn't a doctor, and taking it off the wrong way could send Reed into neural shock. But newer generation micro-delivery devices connect by Bluetooth to the treating physician's phone to sync dosing schedules and delivery levels. If Corinne was managing the device from her phone, then the Bluetooth signal would still be broadcasting somewhere inside the penthouse. Elise opened the laptop, activated the Bluetooth scanner, and waited. 11 devices appeared within scan range. She ruled them out one by one. Micah's iPad, the sound system, the television, the wireless keyboard, the door sensors, until only one unnamed device remained, identified only by a serial code, broadcasting a steady signal from somewhere in the penthouse. She opened the connection protocol. Medical devices often have weaker security than phones or computers because they are designed for doctors to access quickly in emergencies. The manufacturer's default password is never changed in more than 60% of cases. Elise tried the default code, connected. The device log opened on the laptop screen like a diary Corinne had never imagined anyone would read. 6 months of data, dosages, delivery times, compound codes. Elise looked at the compound code and searched the pharmaceutical database. No result in the list of FDA-approved drugs. She widened the search into the clinical trial database. The result came up. An experimental cognitive suppressant, never past phase 3, originally designed for Alzheimer's research but halted because of side effects that included short-term memory loss, impaired judgment, and a prolonged state of cognitive clouding. Undetectable in standard blood work unless a doctor knew exactly what to test for. Elise sat still for 30 seconds. Then she started downloading. The full log, the complete dosage history, the entire compound code trail, onto the laptop, and then backed up to the external hard drive. 2 copies. Pearl had said you need evidence. This was evidence, but she couldn't shut the device down. If she did, the app on Corinne's phone would alert immediately. Corinne would know someone had interfered, and everything Elise had just gathered would become useless because Corinne would have time to erase the rest of the trail. The device had to keep running, Reed had to keep being poisoned, and Elise had to find a way to end this before the next dose was delivered. She needed someone on the inside, someone who knew the Calloway family, knew the system, knew Corinne, and had stayed silent long enough to be carrying more guilt than sleep. She needed Weston Calloway. Micah had Uncle Weston's phone number saved in the iPad contacts, tucked between the private chef's number and the old driver's number, the one who had been fired 3 months earlier. He recited the number to Elise without opening the contact list. Knew it by heart, the same way he knew door codes and security schedules, by the repetition inside the mind of a child who understood that information was the only weapon no one could confiscate from a 7-year-old. Elise called from her own phone. 2 rings. Weston Calloway answered and said nothing for the first 3 seconds, the kind of silence that belongs to a man deciding whether to hang up or keep listening. Elise said, "Micah gave me this number. I'm a forensic auditor. I'm inside your brother's penthouse, and I have evidence of what's being put into his body every night." 4 more seconds of silence. Then Weston spoke, his voice rough and tired. "The coffee shop on the corner of Michigan and 11th. 30 minutes. Elise left the penthouse with Micah through the service entrance, the same way they had come in. She left Micah in his room with only one instruction. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone unless you hear my voice calling your name." Micah nodded as if he had been hearing instructions like that all his life. The coffee shop was small, half below street level, with stairs leading down, dim light, and the smell of roasted coffee and old bread. Weston Calloway was already seated at the last table against the wall, his back to the window. He was 28, but looked 35. Dark circles under his eyes, beard not shaved, coat wrinkled as though he had slept in it. He had Reed's face, but softer, never sharpened by the kind of power his brother carried, and now worn down by something else. Guilt. Elise sat across from him and laid her phone on the table. Screen dark, not recording, not yet recording. She needed him talking before she needed evidence. Weston didn't ask who she was, didn't ask where she had come from, didn't ask who had hired her. He asked only one thing. Is the boy okay? Elise said Micah was okay. Weston looked at the cup of coffee in front of him, already cold, untouched, and then he began to speak. 4 months earlier, he had seen the first sign. Reed forgot the board meeting he himself had called. Not late, not mixed up on the time. He forgot it completely, as if the meeting had never existed in his mind at all. Weston asked Corinne. Corinne said Reed was dealing with a health issue. She was managing things. Everything was under control. Weston didn't believe her. He told Reed directly that Corinne had too much control, that he needed a different doctor, that something was wrong. Reed listened and said nothing for 2 days. Then, on the 3rd day, Reed called Weston into his office and threw him out of the company. It wasn't Reed speaking. It was Corinne's language coming out of Reed's mouth. You're jealous. You want to take power. You were never good enough to stand beside me. Weston said he looked into his brother's eyes that day and didn't see Reed. He saw a man reading lines from a script someone else had written, and not lucid enough to know he was reading lines. Weston walked away, not because he accepted it, but because he didn't know what else to do when the only person who could hear him was the very person being controlled by someone else. He hired his own lawyer, tried to find a way to intervene through the courts, but on paper Reed was fully competent, and Corinne made sure of that. The dosage was enough to control him, but not enough to create the kind of obvious clinical evidence a court would recognize. Elise showed Weston the device logs on her laptop. The compound code, the dosage history, 6 months of data. Weston looked at the screen and said nothing for nearly a full minute. His jaw locked tight, his eyes reddening without tears. The kind of pain carried by a man who has suspected the truth for a very long time, yet still finds it different when the truth appears in numbers, because numbers can't be denied. Then he said, "The signing has been moved up to tomorrow night." Elise told him she knew. She had heard it through the intercom. Weston nodded. The annual Callaway Holdings charity event, hosted at the Art Institute of Chicago, 300 guests, with lawyers, a notary, witnesses, everyone already in place. Corinne only had to bring Reed into a private room on the 2nd floor, put a pen in his hand, and the authorization papers would be signed in front of enough official eyes that no one could challenge it later. The man behind it all, Weston said, was named Trent Moreau. Elise looked at him. Weston said Trent wasn't a business partner, wasn't a friend, wasn't an ally. Trent was a man who wanted to swallow Callaway Holdings whole and had spent 3 years placing his pieces exactly where they needed to be. Elise looked at the clock. 9:17 on Monday morning. The signing was scheduled for 10 o'clock Tuesday night. She had 28 hours. She needed 3 things. Evidence strong enough to force the lawyer to stop the signing. That part she already had. The device logs and the transfer data. A way into the event. And Weston nodded. He would handle the invitations. But the 3rd thing made them both fall silent. A way to wake Reed up. Not wake him forever. Not cure him. Just wake him long enough, clearly enough, for him to decide not to sign his own name. The device was still running. The next dose would be delivered at 2 in the morning tomorrow, and Elise couldn't shut it down. Weston looked at her. I don't know how to make him lucid. Then he paused, lowered his eyes to the cold coffee in front of him, and added, his voice quieter now. But Micah does. The boy always knows. Elise returned through the same service entrance, greeted by the same sterile, biting cold of the concrete hallways. Corinne was gone. Micah confirmed it by text. Before Elise got into the elevator, she left at 9:45. He heard the main elevator. Elise knocked on Micah's door 3 times in the pattern they had agreed on. The door opened. Micah was sitting back on the bed, the iPad on his lap, the stuffed bear with the worn ear beside him. He looked at her with a question in his eyes and didn't need to open his mouth for her to hear it. Elise sat down on the ottoman across from him and went straight to it. I need to know if there's anything that makes your dad react. Anything at all. A song, a smell, a voice, a memory. Something strong enough that even if his mind is covered in fog, it can still cut through. Micah didn't answer right away. He looked down at the iPad, then up at the photograph on the wall, the one of Reed and him sitting on the steps, him 4 years old, grinning wide, his father still whole. Then he did something Elise didn't expect. He opened the iPad, went into the settings, and unlocked a hidden folder protected by a 6-character password that his small fingers entered too quickly for Elise to catch. Inside the folder was only one file, an audio recording. 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Micah stared at that file for a few more seconds as if making one final decision, then pressed play. Reed's voice filled the small room, and Elise felt the air change. This wasn't the voice of the man she had seen standing in the doorway an hour earlier, the man with the clouded eyes and the uneven steps across the marble floor. This was a different voice, warm, clear, resonant, carrying power but softened in the way only a father softens when speaking to his son in the dark. Reed was telling a story about Micah's grandfather, the man who built the first Calloway family business out of a construction supply truck bought with borrowed money, driving 16 hours a day on the worst roads south of Chicago. Grandfather didn't have a college degree, didn't have connections, didn't have anything except his 2 hands and a refusal to bend. Reed's voice moved slowly, with rhythm, like a man who had told this story many times and found something new in it each time. At the end of the recording, his voice dropped lower, closer, as if he were leaning down right beside his son's face, and said, "You remember this. A Calloway never kneels, not even when the sky comes down." Then silence, then the rustle of blankets, then the end. 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Elise sat still. She looked at Micah. The boy was sitting still too, both hands wrapped around the iPad in his lap, eyes lowered to the dark screen, and on his face was something Elise recognized because she had worn it on her own face for 20 years, missing someone who was still alive, but no longer here. "When did you record it?" Elise asked. 8 months ago, Micah said. "Before she came." He paused. "I recorded it because I was afraid I'd forget my dad's voice. I didn't know he would be the one who forgot." Elise said nothing for 10 seconds. She let those words settle in the air of the small room with the wrinkled pale blue blanket and the stuffed bear with the worn ear, and she thought of Pearl. She didn't have a recording of Pearl's voice. She had nothing except the silver bracelet and one sentence she had kept alive in her head by sheer will, because she was afraid that if she didn't repeat it often enough, it would disappear. Micah had been smarter than she was. He had preserved his father's voice digitally, 4 minutes and 22 seconds, safe inside a hidden folder, protected by a password, no matter what happened. The plan that formed in Elise's mind didn't come from logic. It came from instinct. This recording wasn't a code, wasn't a spell, wasn't an antidote. It was evidence. Evidence of the man Reed Calloway had once been. And if she played that recording in front of Reed at the right moment, in the right place, in the signing room, in front of the lawyer and the notary, he would hear his own voice from when he had still been whole. The distance between that voice and the man sitting there with a pen in his hand would be the clearest evidence of all that something had been taken from him. Even if Reed didn't wake fully, even if the fog didn't lift, any lawyer with a conscience would have to stop when confronted with the difference between those two versions of the same man. Elise didn't sleep that night. She sat on the floor of Micah's room, her back against the bed, laptop open on her lap, the screen light the only light in the room. Micah slept above her, breathing soft and even, the iPad tucked beneath his pillow the way another child might sleep with a teddy bear. Elise untangled the transfer data, traced the 4 shell companies, built out the money flow chart, marked every irregularity in red notes. Pearl's silver bracelet lay cold against her wrist, brushing the edge of the laptop every time she typed. 22 hours left. Outside the window, Chicago slept. Inside this room, a 7-year-old boy and a 27-year-old woman were guarding a secret the whole Calloway empire didn't know. The Art Institute of Chicago, 8:15 on Tuesday night. Elise stood at the south entrance on Michigan Avenue in a black dress borrowed from the old wardrobe Marin had left behind, the one Micah had shown her in the basement of the penthouse. Clothes Corinne hadn't cleared out, maybe because she didn't know they existed, or maybe because she simply didn't care. The dress was a little loose in the shoulders but fit well enough at the waist, and Elise found herself thinking about the woman who had once worn it, the brown-haired woman smiling in the face-down photograph on the bookshelf, and wondering whether Marin had ever imagined that her dress would one day be worn by an orphaned auditor, trying to save her husband from the woman who had replaced her. The invitation rested inside her clutch, a false name arranged by Weston, a guest of Calloway Holdings' finance division, legitimate enough to pass security at the door but not important enough for anyone to remember her face. Elise stepped inside, and the first thing she did wasn't admire the art or look for a glass of champagne. She counted. 4 guards in the main hall, 2 in black suits with earpieces, two in museum uniforms. Two more guards in the east corridor near the staircase leading to the second floor. One roaming guard moving between the galleries, on a cycle of roughly 12 minutes. 7 visible cameras, maybe more in the blind corners. 3 exits, the main south entrance, the side door to the east near the restrooms, and the north emergency door leading out to the museum loading area. Elise took it all in within less than 2 minutes, then lifted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and moved into the main hall. Griffin Court opened before her like the heart of a secular cathedral. A glass-vaulted ceiling soaring dozens of feet overhead. Warm golden light reflecting across the white marble floor. A crystal chandelier hung at the center, spilling light down over 300 guests in evening gowns and tailored suits, whose total value could probably have funded a public hospital. A string quartet played in the east corner, Debussy flowing through the crowd like water, while the sound of polite laughter rippled through the air, clinking as softly as the champagne glasses themselves. Then Corinne entered. She walked first, Reed half a step behind, and the way she led him said everything words never needed to touch. Corinne's right hand wasn't holding Reed's hand, wasn't laced through his fingers, wasn't resting against his back. Her hand held his elbow from underneath, thumb pressing lightly into the inside of his arm, controlling direction, pace, angle. When someone approached to greet them, Corinne turned Reed toward that person with the smallest pressure against his elbow, like a handler working a puppet with invisible strings. When any conversation lasted longer than 2 minutes, she gave the slightest tug, and Reed turned away, obedient, unresisting, unaware. That wasn't the way a woman guides the man she loves. That was the way a handler guides an asset. Reed was beautiful. Elise saw that and didn't deny it. The black 3-piece suit was cut perfectly across his broad shoulders, the tie dark, the hair brushed back, the jaw sharp. He looked like a magazine cover, like a campaign poster for power and success. And most of the people in the room who looked at him saw exactly that. But Elise watched his eyes. His eyes lagged half a beat behind his mouth. When someone told a joke, his mouth smiled on cue, but his eyes didn't react until half a second later, as if the signal had to travel through a layer of thick cotton before it reached him. When he shook hands, his arm extended at the proper moment, but the grip came a fraction late, a fraction weaker than a man built like him should have had. He was functioning, but in low-power mode, enough to fool 300 people drinking champagne, not enough to fool a forensic auditor who had seen the marks of his fingers on her wrist 24 hours earlier. Elise moved through the galleries, sparkling water in her hand, wearing the polite, blank expression of an unimportant guest. She passed through the Impressionist rooms, through the modern wing, and stopped in the West Photography Gallery when she saw him. Trent Moreau stood in the corner of the room, a glass of red wine in his hand, speaking with 2 men Elise recognized. Not their faces, their names. 2 names she had seen in the Shell Company records the night before, while sitting on the floor of Micah's bedroom. 2 listed directors tied to 2 of the 4 shell companies, through which the $40 million had moved. They were standing here now, holding wine, smiling, talking to the man whose voice had ordered, "Increase the dosage if you have to," through the intercom yesterday morning. What did Trent Moreau look like? 40 years old, salt and pepper hair cut short, a lean, angular face, small bright eyes with that look of constant calculation. He wore a light gray suit in a sea of black ones, noticeable just enough to show he didn't have to obey the rules, not enough to draw attention. He watched Corinne and Reed from across the room with the expression Elise had seen on men standing behind hostile takeovers, the look of an owner assessing property, not an ally watching a friend. Elise's phone vibrated. A text from Weston. "Private room, 2nd floor. 10 p.m. East stairs." Elise checked the time. 9:13. 47 minutes. She lifted her gaze and caught the thing she had known was coming, yet still felt along the back of her neck like ice. Corinne Voss was looking at her. From across Griffin Court, through 300 guests, through the chandelier light, through Debussy's music, Corinne was looking straight at Elise, not glancing, not by accident, looking directly, assessing, measuring. The smile was still on Corinne's lips from whatever conversation she had just been having, but her eyes had shifted completely to Elise, and in those blue eyes there was no surprise, only calculation. Elise left the main hall and headed toward the restrooms on the east side, not because she needed to go in, but because she needed to get out from under Corinne's gaze long enough to breathe. The east corridor was quieter, the lighting softer. the music and laughter from Griffin Court reduced to a distant echo. She had taken 10 steps when she heard heels behind her. Not hurried, intentional. Even confident. The kind of footsteps made by someone who doesn't need to run because she already knows exactly where the prey is. Elise turned. Corinne Voss stood 4 meters away, in the middle of the corridor, beneath a landscape painting probably worth more than both of them put together. She was wearing a navy dress, her hair pinned high, small diamonds in her ears, and her blue eyes were fixed on Elise with the absolute concentration of someone who had already finished analyzing the threat and was now deciding how to handle it. "I know who you are," Corinne said. Her voice wasn't cold. That was the most frightening part. It was warm, controlled, friendly, in exactly the way a skilled doctor speaks to a patient before delivering bad news. Elise Whitfield, forensic auditor. Graduated top of her class from the University of Illinois. No criminal record, no family, no partner. Rents an office on the 4th floor in the South Loop. 6-month lease, paid by personal transfer. She tilted her head. "My security dashboard flagged a synchronization anomaly only an hour ago, an unauthorized Bluetooth handshake with Reed's medical patch that didn't come from my phone. I went back and scrubbed the raw data logs. That's when I saw it. A door code entry at 7:47 yesterday morning, and a system login at 8:03. You've been hiding in my home for over a day, haven't you, Elise?" Elise stood still, didn't step back, didn't speak. "I didn't know Micah was smart enough to do this," Corinne went on, and there was something in her voice, almost like admiration, the kind of admiration a scientist feels when she discovers a variable she underestimated. "But now I do, and I know you're here because of the boy, so let's speak like adults." Corinne took 2 steps forward. The space between them was now only 2 meters. $2 million, she said, wired into any account you want, at any bank you choose, within 24 hours. You take a cab to O'Hare right now, board any flight to anywhere, and you never come back to Chicago. Elise still didn't speak. "Or," Corinne said, and her tone didn't change, still warm, still patient, still perfectly controlled. "I make one phone call. 15 minutes later, you'll have an arrest warrant for unlawful entry into a private residence, theft of protected medical data, and unauthorized access to a personal computer system. I have logs. I have timestamps. I have lawyers better than anyone you could hire with the balance in your bank account, which I also checked, and it isn't enough to keep a good lawyer for 3 days. Corinne stopped. She looked Elise over from head to toe, slowly, thoroughly, the way a doctor evaluates a patient. Then she added, her voice softer now, almost gentle. The kind of gentleness so deliberate it had been calibrated to do maximum damage. "You have no one, Elise. I checked. No parents, no siblings, no close friends, no lover, not one person in this world who'd pick up the phone if you disappeared tonight. You're a line in a database, a file in a system, and files can be deleted." Silence. Empty corridor. Debussy drifting faintly in the distance. Elise felt those words enter through her breastbone and stop in the place she'd spent 20 years walling off. She had no one. That part was true. It had always been true since the moment Pearl closed her eyes in a hospital on the west side, and 14-year-old Elise stood alone in the corridor, no one holding her hand, no one calling her name, no one telling her where she was supposed to go next. And for one moment there in the corridor of the Art Institute of Chicago, beneath a landscape painting worth millions, Elise almost believed Corinne was right. Then she remembered. Yesterday morning, 7:12. A child standing outside her office door, Spider-Man backpack, cracked corner iPad, feet not touching the floor when he sat in the chair. "I need to hire you. I have money." She had no one, but Micah had no one too, and he had still come. Elise looked at Corinne. "I've been deleted from systems more times than you think, Corinne." Her voice was flat, steady, not angry, not challenging, just true. At 9, foster care deleted me from my first family. At 11, it deleted me from the second. At 14, my grandmother died, and the system deleted me from the last person who ever loved me. At 17, I deleted myself from that system for good. She paused. "So go ahead and try to delete me, but I think you'll find I'm harder to erase than you expect." Corinne looked at her for 3 more seconds. Her face didn't change. No anger, no surprise. But something shifted in her eyes. A calculation being updated. A variable being repriced. Then she turned and walked away, the rhythmic, sharp staccato of her departure echoing through the hall, and disappeared back into the main hall without looking over her shoulder. Elise stood alone in the corridor. Her hand was shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, because she had just refused $2 million and a way out, and now she was standing in the middle of a museum with 37 minutes before the signing and no road left to retreat down. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. A text message. I know who you are. I know where you are. Leave. Not Corinne. Corinne had just stood in front of her and hadn't needed to text. This was someone else. Elise looked at the message and thought of the man's voice on the intercom yesterday morning, the voice that had said, "Increase the dosage if you have to." Trent Moreau knew she was here. 9:53 that night. Elise stood before the dark wooden door of the private room on the second floor, at the end of the east staircase, where the music and laughter from the main hall couldn't reach. She could hear voices inside, low, professional, the voices of people paid very well to be present and not ask questions. She placed her hand on the doorknob. Her hand didn't shake, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had used up all the shaking 10 minutes earlier in the corridor, and now there was nothing left but the cold stillness of someone who has already made her decision. She opened the door. The private room had been arranged like a miniature boardroom. A long wooden table, 6 chairs, warm lighting. 2 lawyers sat to the left, 1 man and 1 woman, both in gray suits, grave-faced, carrying the posture of people carrying out a duty rather than having a thought. The notary sat at a side table, seal and documents prepared in neat order. 2 witnesses sat along the right wall, backs straight, hands on their laps, in the exact posture of people hired to observe, not intervene. Corinne sat across from Reed, her hand resting on the table near his, not touching, but close enough to control. And Reed sat at the head of the table, the biggest chair, the seat of greatest power, yet he sat in it like a guest in his own life. The suit was still perfect, the jaw was still sharp, but his eyes were working slowly, moving over the papers on the table without reading them, like a man trying to remember where he was and why. His right hand held a pen. The tip hovered less than half an inch above the paper. Elise stepped inside, and every head in the room turned toward her. Corinne was the first to rise, faster than anyone else, fast enough to show she had been waiting for this moment, had known it would come, and had prepared for it. "Security," Corinne said, her voice controlled, sharp, not shouted, but cutting through the room like a blade. Elise didn't look at Corinne. She looked at Reed. She walked straight to the table, each step even, neither hurried nor slow, set her phone down on the wooden surface directly in front of him, and pressed play. Reed's voice filled the room, not the voice of the man sitting at the head of the table, the voice of the man from 8 months earlier. Warm, clear, rich, resonant, the voice of a father telling a story to his son in the dark, a voice speaking of his own father, the truck, the bad roads south of Chicago, the voice of a man still whole. The room went still. The woman lawyer looked at the man lawyer. The notary stopped moving. The 2 witnesses sat straighter. And Reed Calloway, the most powerful man south of the Chicago River, sat at the head of the table with a pen in his hand, listening to his own voice coming from a phone placed before him. The pen fell, not because his hand was weak. It fell because his hand opened, the fingers slowly uncurling as if waking up, and the pen rolled across the wood and came to rest beside the unsigned authorization papers. The recording went on, speaking of endurance, of family, of the backbone of the Calloway line. Then the final words came. "You remember this. A Calloway never kneels, not even when the sky comes down." Silence. The recording ended. Reed raised his right hand, slowly, and touched the back of his neck with 2 fingers, the place where the medical patch sat beneath his hairline. He touched it like a man realizing for the first time that something was there, his fingers brushing the edge of the patch, feeling it, and his face did something the fog had prevented for 6 months. It asked a question. "What is this?" His voice was slow, rough, but there was something under it pushing upward, like underground water rising through a crack. Elise answered, brief, exact, in the language of a forensic auditor. The micro-delivery device attached at the back of his neck was continuously administering an unapproved cognitive suppressant. The device logs showed 6 months of use, steadily increasing dosage, compound code matching a terminated clinical trial. 4 transfers of $10 million each had been executed using his biometrics. harvested while he was unconscious, from a second device registered under the name Corinne Voss. This is fabricated. Corinne stepped toward the table, her tone shifting from sharp to clinical, from controlled to professionally concerned. This woman unlawfully entered the penthouse yesterday morning. She unlawfully accessed a personal computer and protected medical systems. Nothing she says has any legal value. Reed is going through a period of severe stress, and as his treating physician, I insist this agitation stop immediately. Corinne turned to the lead attorney. Call security. Now. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. 2 guards arrived quickly. Corinne had arranged it in advance, and they appeared at the door in under 15 seconds. But the door didn't open. Weston Calloway was standing there, his back against it from the hallway side, both hands in his trouser pockets, face exhausted but posture straight, truly straight for the first time in 4 months. I'm Weston Calloway, he said to the guards, his voice level and clear. Reed Calloway's brother, board member of Calloway Holdings. If you step past me, I call the FBI in 30 seconds, and the file I submit will include the name of every person in this room tonight. The guards looked at each other. Neither man stepped forward. Corinne turned back to face the room, her eyes calculating distance, measuring options, and in that moment, Elise saw the thing she had seen in every fraudster she had ever faced when the last escape route was cut off. Not fear, but calculation moving faster than reality allowed. The lead attorney, the silver-haired man seated to the left, looked at the documents on the table, looked at Reed touching the back of his own neck with the face of a man who has just discovered something living on his body that he didn't know was there, then looked at Corinne. He spoke in the slow, careful tone only a lawyer who knows he's standing on a fresh legal fault line can use. I think we need to suspend these proceedings. Reed didn't look at the lawyer, didn't look at Corinne, didn't look at Elise. He looked at his hands, both of them resting on the wooden table, then lifted his gaze, and for the first time that night, his eyes searched for something specific. Not memory, not clarity, but a person. My son, Reed said. His voice broke on the second word, soft, nearly inaudible, but everyone heard it. Where is he? The neurologist arrived at the penthouse at 1:30 on Wednesday morning, summoned by Weston the moment Corinne was removed. He worked through the night to stabilize Reed's vitals, explaining that they had to wait for the heart rate to plateau to prevent a fatal neural shock before finally being safe enough to peel the patch away at dawn. He brought 2 nurses, portable testing equipment, and the face of a man who had just been briefed on a situation unlike anything he had seen in 30 years of practice. The first thing he did was remove the patch from the back of Reed's neck. He used a special solution to loosen the medical adhesive, gently, slowly, and when the patch lifted from the skin, Elise saw what had been underneath it, a faint red area of irritation, where the device had remained in constant contact for 6 months, delivering drugs through the skin 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without stopping. The doctor placed the device into an evidence bag Elise had already prepared. 2 copies. Chain of custody. Pearl had said you need evidence. Detoxification began immediately. The doctor explained that the compound would take anywhere from 48 to 72 hours to clear the nervous system, but the symptoms would start to improve sooner. Within 12 to 24 hours, once the blood concentration dropped below the threshold of effectiveness, Reed lay on the bed in the master bedroom that no longer belonged to Corinne, monitored by the medical team after private security had escorted her out of the penthouse at 1 a.m. Reed lay there with his eyes closed, not asleep, but enduring. The doctor said recovery wouldn't be comfortable. A nervous system suppressed for 6 months was now beginning to come back online, like someone dragged out of a dark room into full sun. Everything too bright, too sharp, too much. Reed would later describe it as feeling like rising from the bottom of a lake, seeing the light above him but not yet being able to bear it, each thought painful, because it was sharper than anything his brain had been allowed to hold for the past half year. That morning Reed was more lucid. Not much. Not enough to process everything, but enough to see his son. Micah stood in the bedroom doorway at 8:45, still in his pajamas, not carrying the iPad, his hands hanging at his sides, and stood there looking at his father with the same face Elise had first seen in the hallway outside her 4th-floor office on Monday morning, the face of someone who had already made every decision and still had no idea what the outcome would be. Reed looked at him. His eyes were still slow, but no longer empty. Something was coming back behind those eyes, not clear yet, not complete yet, but returning, like light slipping through a door left slightly open. "I'm sorry," Reed said. His voice was hoarse, weak, completely different from the voice in the 4-minute, 22-second recording. But it was his real voice, the voice of a man speaking from himself, not through a layer of chemical fog. Micah nodded. He didn't cry. He didn't run forward to hug him. He nodded once, slowly, heavily, the nod of someone who had prepared for this moment for a very long time and now that it had come, didn't know what to do with it, because he had spent too much energy holding hope at exactly the right distance, so it wouldn't hurt him, and now he had to find a way to let it come closer without breaking apart. Elise stood in the hallway outside the bedroom, looking through the crack in the door. She didn't go in. That moment didn't belong to her. But she watched, and she remembered. 9 years old, Westside Hospital. Pearl lying in a white bed, eyes closed, her hand cold in Elise's. Elise had held that hand for 4 hours. Not because she thought Pearl would wake, but because she didn't know when she was supposed to let go. No one told her. No one stood beside her in that hospital hallway at 3 a.m. to say, "It's all right now. You can let go. She's gone." Elise had decided on her own to let go. 14 years old, deciding on her own to let go of the last person who had ever loved her. And now she stood in the hallway of the Callaway penthouse, watching a 7-year-old boy trying to find a way to take his father's hand again, and she understood that she was here not because of the $40 million, not because of forensic auditing, but because she had once been Micah. A child with no one. Bad news came at 11 a.m. Weston called Elise's phone, his voice tight with disbelief. Corinne managed to secure an emergency hearing through a corrupt judge Trent had been paying for years. They set a massive bail, and the money was wired instantly from a Singapore account before the district attorney could even file an appeal to block her release. By the time we tracked the transfer and flagged the flight risk, she was already gone. Corinne vanished from Chicago within 3 hours of being released. No one knew where she had gone. The legal system moves slower than money, always slower than money. Elise brought the news into Reed's bedroom. He was sitting up against the headboard, eyes on the window, the Chicago skyline under the midday sun. He listened, and Elise saw it. Not the fog. The fog was lifting, slowly, but lifting. What she saw beneath the fog, what was beginning to show as the chemicals withdrew, was anger. Not hot anger, not shouting or smashing, cold anger, quiet, controlled. The kind of anger carried by a man who had built an empire through patience and methodical ruthlessness, and was now applying both of those things to a single target. Reed's jaw tightened, his hand on the blanket closed, then opened again, slowly, with control, like a man reminding himself it wasn't time yet. He said nothing for 30 seconds. Then he looked at Elise, and in his eyes, for the first time, she saw no fog, no confusion, no disorientation. She saw Reed Callaway. The lion was waking. 3 days later, Elise sat in Reed's office at Callaway Tower, and the figure of $40 million she had been carrying since Monday morning became an old number. 40 million had only been the surface. When Elise dove deeper, when she traced not just the 4 most recent transfers but the full transaction history of Callaway Holdings over the past 2 years, she found what lay underneath. 17 smaller transfers, scattered across 23 months, each one between $1 and $5 million, moving through different shell companies registered in 6 countries, none of them large enough to trigger a bank's automatic alerts, none of them clear enough in pattern for a routine internal audit to catch. But Elise wasn't a routine auditor. She was the kind of person who read patterns inside chaos, who saw shape where everyone else saw noise. And the pattern here became unmistakable once she knew what to look for. Every single transfer passed through at least one entity linked to Trent Moreau. The total damage wasn't 40 million. The total damage was $90 million. Trent Moreau had been draining blood from Callaway Holdings for 2 years. Slowly, patiently, 1 drop at a time. And the 40 million in the most recent 3 weeks had only been the final phase. The phase where he no longer needed to hide, because he believed Reed would sign the authorization papers, and everything would be laundered into legality before anyone had time to look closely. Elise worked 16 hours a day. Reed's office became a war room, the desk covered in documents, 2 laptop screens open side by side, flowcharts taped to the walls, and in those hours, something began to change, not on the paper, but in the air between the two of them. Reed came into the office at 3 in the morning on the second night. The fog was still there, lighter now, but still there. The doctor had said his nervous system would need weeks to recover completely. He didn't say anything when he walked in. He set a cup of black coffee on the desk beside Elise's laptop, then sat down in the chair across from her. Elise looked at the coffee. She had never told him what she drank. He had noticed. The man who 6 days earlier hadn't recognized his own son had sat somewhere in that penthouse and watched her drink coffee enough times to know she took it black, no sugar. She didn't say thank you. She took one sip, then turned back to the screen and began explaining. Not explaining to a client, not explaining to a lawyer, explaining to him. She pointed to the flow chart on the wall and told him how the money had moved through the system, how the shell companies concealed the source, how the biometrics had been harvested to create electronic authorization, how each link connected to the next until the whole chain led back to one man. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't push back. He didn't pretend to understand what he hadn't yet understood. He listened in a way no one had ever listened to Elise before, with complete attention, no hidden agenda, no attempt to steer the conversation toward the conclusion he wanted. For the first time in 6 months, someone was speaking to Reed Calloway without trying to manipulate him. And maybe, Elise thought as she watched him sitting there in the glow of the screens at 3 in the morning, maybe for the first time in a very long while, someone was speaking to her and truly listening. On the third night, Reed asked her about the silver bracelet. She was typing, the bracelet tapping faintly against the edge of the laptop, and he asked in an ordinary voice, not overly curious, "Whose was it?" She looked at the bracelet. "My grandmother's." He didn't ask anything more. He understood from those 2 words that her grandmother was gone, because people don't say "was" that way about someone still living. He nodded, then looked back at the flowchart on the wall. The respect was in not asking further. Elise noticed that, and remembered it. Thursday afternoon, Micah came into the office. He wasn't carrying evidence. He wasn't bringing new information. He only brought his iPad and sat down in the corner of the room, back against the wall, legs stretched out, then opened a notes app. He typed something, then turned the iPad so Elise could see it. On the screen was a list. The title read, "Safe People." Under it were 3 names: Dad, Uncle Weston, Elise. No explanation. No criteria. Just 3 names on a list that formed the only circle of trust in the boy's world. The people who had seen him, heard him, and refused to let the fog take everything away. Elise looked at the screen, looked at her name beneath the word Dad. The silver bracelet lay cold against her wrist. She didn't say anything. She only nodded at Micah, a small, level nod, enough for the boy to understand that she had seen it, she had read it, and she would not fail that list. Elise found Marin's ghost on the 6th day, buried in the 7th layer of the shell company chain, inside a folder she had almost skipped. The folder had no label, only a numerical code, sitting on the encrypted server Trent Moreau used for internal communication with his financial entities. Elise had cracked access to that server through Corinne's device logs. Because Corinne had used the same root password for the medical system and her internal email, the classic mistake even smart people make when they believe no one is watching. Inside the folder were letters, invoices, and a contract. Correspondence between Trent and a third party Elise didn't recognize, discussing the preparation phase and the removal of the principal obstacle in language so coldly corporate she had to read it twice before she understood they were talking about human beings, not assets. An invoice from a private security consulting firm in Detroit, paid 3 months before Marin Calloway died, for services described as risk assessment and situation handling, and the contract, short, 1 page, between Trent and Corinne Voss, signed 11 months before Corinne appeared in Reed's life, spelling out roles, timeline, and division of assets after the completion of the transfer of control. 11 months before Corinne met Reed, meant the contract had been signed 8 months before Marin died. Trent had planned Marin's death before it happened. He had signed an agreement with the replacement before removing the woman who needed to be replaced. Marin Calloway hadn't died in an accident. Marin died because she was the obstacle. She was the person Reed trusted most, the one he listened to, the only one with enough influence to make him ask questions if someone tried to get close to him with bad intentions. Trent understood that, and Trent removed her. Then he waited long enough for Reed to grieve, for Reed to be lonely, for a space to open that Corinne could step into. 3 years. A 3-year plan. Patient, cold, and perfect. right up until a 7-year-old boy took an Uber to the office of an auditor Trent didn't even know existed. Elise printed the documents. 12 pages. She set them on the desk in the office and went to find Reed. He was sitting in the living room, in the leather chair by the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. A glass of water in his hand that he wasn't drinking. The fog was almost completely gone. The doctor said his cognitive recovery was on schedule. His eyes were quicker now, his voice clearer, and every now and then Elise caught a glimpse in the way he looked, in the way he processed information, of the man Micah had recorded 8 months earlier, the lion before the fog. Elise sat down in the chair across from him and placed the 12 pages on the table between them. She said, "You need to read this, and I need to stay here while you do." Reed looked at her for 3 more seconds, hearing in her voice that this wasn't an ordinary financial report, then picked up the stack. He read slowly, page by page. Elise watched his face change. First page, unreadable. Second page, jaw tightening. Third page, his grip on the paper hardening. Fourth page, the page with the contract between Trent and Corinne, signed 8 months before Marin died. His hand stopped. His eyes went over the same passage again and again. Then he set the papers down. He didn't throw them. He didn't crush them. He set them down gently, precisely. And that was more frightening than any violent reaction could have been, because that control wasn't calm. It was rage frozen into something denser, heavier, more dangerous. Reed looked out the window. The Chicago skyline in the evening light, glass and steel catching the sinking sun, and Elise saw the thing she had been afraid to see. Not the fog. The fog was gone. What lay beneath it, what had been there all along for 6 months waiting for the chemicals to recede, was pain. Pure, undiluted, unfiltered. The pain of a man who had just learned his wife had been murdered, that he had spent 3 years blaming himself for failing to protect her, that every night he had lain awake asking himself what he had done wrong, and the answer was that he had done nothing wrong at all. Someone had deliberately taken her away to create the space they needed. His eyes were red, but there were no tears. His jaw was clenched so tightly, Elise could see the muscle rising beneath the skin. His hand on his thigh closed into a fist, and then opened again, slowly, with control, his fingers trembling slightly. Elise didn't speak. She only reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, lightly, not gripping, not stroking, simply resting there, her hand with Pearl's silver bracelet touching his arm through the fabric of his shirt. He didn't pull away. He didn't look at her hand. He gave no response except not pulling away, and sometimes that is enough. Sometimes allowing someone to touch you is the loudest thing a man who has lost all trust can say. They sat there in silence for 3 minutes. Then Reed spoke, his voice low and even. "I need every number, every name, every path, and I need you to stay." Elise looked at him. "I need access to everything, no exceptions." He nodded. "Especially the things you want hidden." He looked at her for the first time since finishing the documents, and in his eyes, Elise saw something she recognized because she had carried it herself for 20 years. The loneliness of someone who has lost everything and is looking for exactly one person to trust. He said, "Especially those things." Elise finished the file on the 12th day, 200 pages. Every page was one link in the chain of evidence she had built from a 7-year-old boy's cracked corner iPad all the way to the encrypted server of a transnational criminal operation. $90 million traced through 43 financial entities in 6 countries, each transfer tied to a timestamp, device code, and proof of harvested biometrics. The contract between Trent and Corinne, the invoice from the Detroit security firm, 6 months of micro-delivery device logs, and at the center of it all, like the spider in the middle of the web, was the name Trent Moreau. Elise printed 3 copies. 1 copy for Callaway Holdings lawyers. 1 copy she kept, backed up on the external hard drive inside the pocket of the coat she never let out of her sight. The 3rd copy she sent to the FBI. She sent it through a private channel, directly to the Federal Financial Crimes Unit she had worked with on an embezzlement case 3 years earlier. She didn't ask Reed before sending it. She sent it first, then told him. Reed was standing by the office window when Elise told him. He turned, looked at her, and said nothing for 5 seconds. She waited. She knew he understood what this meant. An FBI file meant the official legal system was now involved, which meant everything would move through courts, through evidence, through lawyers, slowly, publicly, and with no way to control the outcome. For a man who had built an empire on control, That was the hardest thing to accept. Reed said, "Good." One word. Then he turned back to the window, and Elise understood that this was why he trusted her. Not because she was good at what she did, not because she had uncovered $90 million, but because she hadn't asked permission. She had done the right thing, even though it was inconvenient for him. And in Reed Calloway's world, where everyone said whatever he wanted to hear, a person who told the truth without waiting for approval was rarer than $90 million. But Reed didn't only wait for the legal system. The legal system is slow. Reed isn't. Over the following week, Elise watched him work from the shared office and understood that she was seeing the other face of the lion. Reed didn't order anyone killed. He didn't order anyone beaten. He picked up the phone and called, one call at a time. Trent's business partners, Trent's suppliers, Trent's banks. Every call was brief, polite, his voice as ordinary as if he were talking about the weather. He said simple things. "Trent Moreau won't be able to meet any financial obligation within 72 hours. I thought you should know in advance." Then he hung up. No threats, no explanations, just information. And information, in the world Reed lived in, was a more devastating weapon than any gun. In 4 days, Trent Moreau's financial network collapsed from the inside out. Partners withdrew. Banks froze accounts. Suppliers terminated contracts. Trent Moreau wasn't shot. He was starved. A mafia boss doesn't fight with bullets. A mafia boss fights with ruin. The FBI arrested Trent Moreau at O'Hare Airport on the 18th day, while he was trying to board a flight to Zurich using a second passport. He didn't have enough money left in any active account to hire defense counsel. Reed had made certain of that. Corinne Voss was arrested in Miami 2 days later. She confessed in exchange for a reduced sentence, giving full details of the 3-year plan, the device, the compound, Marin's death. She gave her statement in a calm, professional voice, as if she were reading a medical report. And Elise thought that was probably the most frightening thing in this whole story. Not the plan, not the compound, but the calm. 3 weeks later, Elise Whitfield stood in the hallway of the Callery Tower penthouse at 8:17 in the morning, coat on her shoulders, laptop bag at her side, and a small suitcase resting beside her feet on the marble floor. That suitcase was the one she had brought to Chicago 4 years earlier, when she left the foster care system. Small, gray fabric, the zipper slightly jammed on the left side, big enough to hold everything she owned because she had never owned much. The engagement was over. The file had been submitted. $90 million were moving through the legal system now, slowly, properly, in the exact way financial justice always moves. Trent Moreau was in federal detention. Corinne Voss was waiting for trial in Florida. Reed Calloway was recovering. Clearer each day, stronger each day, closer each day to the man in the 4-minute and 22-second recording. And Elise was standing in the hallway with her suitcase by her feet, because that was what she always did. She arrived. She worked. She left. She had left every place she had ever stayed, every foster home, every case, every city, every room that had begun to feel familiar. Leaving was the one thing Elise Whitfield had always known how to do. She was looking at the elevator doors when she heard the sound of small footsteps on the marble. Quick, light, house slippers on hard floor. Micah ran in from the east wing, hair uncombed, wearing an oversized t-shirt and pajama pants, the iPad held against his chest in the exact way Elise had first seen 3 weeks earlier in the hallway outside her 4th-floor office. He stopped in front of her, breathing a little fast. He didn't say anything. He opened the iPad, swiped to the Notes app, and turned the screen toward her. Elise looked. On the screen was a new note, created at 7:53 that morning. Not inside the evidence folder. Not inside the hidden folder. On the home page, open, unhidden, as if he wanted anyone to see it. The note read, "Elise, Tuesday. Black coffee. Smiles when Dad tells bad stories. Stay?" The question mark at the end. Elise looked at that question mark and felt its weight press harder than the 200-page file. Harder than $90 million. Harder than the entire chain of evidence she had built over 3 weeks. One question mark from a 7-year-old boy whose list called Safe People had only 2 names on it. She looked up and saw Reed at the far end of the hallway. He was leaning one shoulder against the wall, hands in his pockets, barefoot, shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He didn't come closer. He stood there, 15 meters away, and watched. The fog was gone completely. His eyes were clear, sharp, And in them was something Elise hadn't seen the first time she met him in Micah's doorway, hadn't seen in the signing room, hadn't seen in those 3 a.m. nights in the office. What she saw now was vulnerability. The most powerful man south of the Chicago River was standing at the far end of his own hallway, standing on the unyielding stone with the quiet strength of a man reborn, and letting her see that he didn't want her to leave. He didn't say it aloud. He didn't need to. He only said, in an ordinary voice, as if talking about the weather, "Your office is still there. I didn't clear it out." Elise looked at him, looked at Micah standing in front of her, iPad pressed against his chest, the question mark glowing on the screen, looked at the elevator doors behind her. Those doors led down to the lobby, out to the street, out to a cab, out to an airport, out to another city, another case, another hallway, another set of elevator doors. She had walked through a lot of doors like that. She looked down at the suitcase. Then she set it down. Not dropped it. Not let go of it. Set it down, gently, like setting down a habit she had carried for 20 years. Micah looked at the suitcase on the floor, looked at her, and he didn't smile, didn't cheer. He only nodded. That small, level nod the two of them had used with each other since the first day. The kind of nod that meant I saw, I understood, and that's enough. Reed at the far end of the hall didn't say anything else. He only pushed his back away from the wall, stood straight, and turned toward the kitchen. Maybe to make coffee, maybe because he needed something for his hands to do while his chest was doing something he still wasn't used to. In forensic auditing, there is a concept called institutional memory, the idea that organizations store information in their structures, the way bones store old fractures. The information is there, whether anyone looks at it or not, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. Every system carries its past inside it. Elise Whitfield had spent her whole life reading other people's fractures. She read them in spreadsheets, in system logs, in money moving through places money was never supposed to go. She had become so good at reading them that she forgot she herself was a system too, carrying fractures of her own. Parents lost in a fire. 3 foster families. Pearl, the silver bracelet, a hospital hallway at 3 a.m, and 20 years of telling herself that leaving was the only thing she knew how to do. But today, in the hallway of the Callaway Tower penthouse, a 7-year-old boy had read her fracture. He didn't read it through spreadsheets or system logs. He read it by watching her drink coffee, watching her smile when his father told bad stories, and writing it down, because for Micah Callaway, observation was love, recording was how you kept something, and a question mark was the bravest way a child could say, "Please don't go." And his father, a man who had lost his wife, lost his memory, lost 6 months of his life, and almost lost everything, stood at the far end of his own hallway, with bare feet on cold stone, and spoke one sentence without ornament. "Your office is still there." That was the way a man who no longer knew how to trust anyone said, "Stay." And Elise, for the first time in 20 years, set her suitcase down. This story didn't begin with money. It began with a 7-year-old boy calling an Uber at 7 a.m, and it ended with a suitcase being placed on a marble floor, gently, like setting down an old habit someone had finally become brave enough to release. If you've been here from beginning to end, I want to thank you. Not thank you for the views, but because you gave your time to sit with a story and let it touch you. This story carries a lesson I think all of us need to hear at least once. Sometimes the person who saves us isn't the strongest, richest, or smartest one, but the one brave enough to see us, truly see us, when the rest of the world turns away. Micah was only a 7-year-old child, but he saw, and he acted. In life, any one of us can be Micah for someone else, the one who sees, the one who remembers, the one who doesn't walk away. I want to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in your own life? Someone who saw you when no one else did? Or someone you wish you'd been brave enough to stay for? Write it in the comments. I read every comment, and I want to hear your story, from the deepest part of your heart. If this story reached you, press like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on, so each day we can listen together to more stories like this one. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and quiet blessing every day. Thank you for being here. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.